It's showtime.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
You know, the right to bear arms is because that's the last form of defense against tyranny.
Washington is fundamentally corrupt. There are more words in the IRS code than there are in the Bible.
Made in America, heard round the world. You're listening to Blunt Force Truth. I'm Chuck Woolery, along with my co-host Mark Young. We've got a good show today. Can't wait to get to it, Mark. By the way, did you see what the DOJ did for their, I guess, the judicial arm of Congress? They wrote this letter and said that everybody it's a broad, wide investigation. They're going to investigate everything.
They're going to, basically just going to investigate 340 million Americans now.
Well, no, but I mean, come on. They said that, all foreign, so that would be Italy, Australia, and Great Britain. We'll see if they want to be cooperative. And then that's everybody in the DNC, everybody in Hillary's camp, everybody that's involved, the FBI with Comey and Strzok and all those people, and McCabe, and then I guess Brennan and Clapper. From the looks of it, they're not going to leave any stone unturned. Well, in the case of this deep state nonsense, they need to leave no stone unturned, Chuck, because I mean, they spent 22 months and $40 million on a fake investigation of the president. Shouldn't the law be applied equally across the board? Yes, but it never is. And you and I both know that, and so do the American people. It's very seldom that people in government are held accountable by other people in government. It just doesn't happen that often. So wherever this goes, whatever comes of it, will not surprise me, except if people are really held accountable, that will surprise me. Well, and perhaps they will this time.
It's because we have a ruling class, my friend.
Well, yeah, they protect each other in an odd way. I mean, Republicans and Democrats are just as guilty, and people know it.
And that's why this president has turned everything upside down, because he's really not a Republican or a Democrat.
Well, exactly right. And, he's come in there as a disruptor, and he's done it in a very positive way, but he's disrupting the swamp for the American people instead of, disrupting the swamp for the sake of disrupting the swamp. And, of course, the swamp is going to hold it against him. And every week we find out more and more who are in the swamp. I mean, this whole thing with this thing with Mexico, I thought was very telling. I mean, it's just amazing what had happened. Here he was, who was it? George Will and a bunch of these people came out and said, you can't do this as a conservative, you blah, blah, blah. And you go on. And he turned everything on its head because they haven't got a clue how to do things. And he's showing them, and they just hate him for it.
Now, you see, his threats of tariff on Mexico worked.
Of course.
It did.
And they
work.
would work for me too.
And you were doubting it was going to work last week. Remember, you were kind of iffy on it. But
well, you never know. You never know about those things. And of course, I know that that's a very liberal. It's not even. It's beyond liberal. It's a leftist, progressive. Government down there. So, and on top of that, it's really funny. If you go back through history, I read a thing called Caribbean by Michener years and years ago. And everywhere Spain landed, they left one thing behind them that stays till today. You know what
corruption.
Absolute corruption. They left it everywhere they hit.
And every place where the British flag flew, they left good capitalism and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, and everywhere, who was it? What's the other one? Oh, the French. They left good food.
So I want to point something out to you before we get to our guest. And we got a great guest today. I'll tell people about that in a minute. California, Chuck, has now decided that they're going to provide Medi-Cal, their healthcare system, to illegal aliens. Mm-hmm. Now, by the way, I think this is okay.
Not the seniors. But you know what? I kind of agree with you. It's okay because it's a state and they can rise or fall on their own, experiments. That's basically what it's supposed to happen in this country.
That's right. I think if California wants to be as socialist as they want to be, within the confines of not interrupting the other 49 states, go be socialist. That's your right to do these things. And let's see what happens to your state.
Right. And then everybody, all the other, 48 or 50 or 67 or what is it now?
There's 57.
They can look at it and say, well, we don't want any part of that, or let's try it.
So the other 56 states can watch California. But this is the point. We can experiment with socialism with 1/10 of the population instead of the whole country. Sure. So we can just let California fall off into the Pacific Ocean from debt and not take the rest of us with them.
Well, apparently they have a whole lot of money set aside because they are the highest state tax in the United States. They tax their people higher than anybody else. It doesn't matter who you are. You're going to get taxed if you go to California for things that you don't even know you're being taxed for as you buy them. But their state tax is very high.
Yeah, their state income tax runs 13.9% at the top rate.
Yeah, no. It's a Democrat state. They're run by Democrats completely. That's their entire Congress is Democrat. The Senate and the House are both Democrat. Now you got Gavin Newsom, who is Nancy Pelosi's. What is he? He's related to her somehow.
I have no idea. But even when Arnold was the governor, it was a Democrat state.
Well, yeah, but Arnold was, come on. Arnold was really he wasn't a conservative. He was Republican in name only.
He was a disaster.
Yeah, right. He was a disaster. So let me see your butt, Arnold. I know Arnold a little bit. He's not a good friend, but I know him.
Mm-hmm. But anyways, I think if the people in California want to go and provide free health care, they have the right to do that because as citizens, we can move out of California. We could go move to California if we support that.
Well, there was one thing that Reagan said. He said, if the whole country goes down the tubes, where are you going to move? There's no place to go.
So how many people do you think will move to California because, other than if you are an illegal alien, but how many not illegal aliens do you think will move to California with the idea, wow, these people are doing the right thing. I want to be there.
I have no idea.
Because liberals want to spend your money, but they never want to spend their own money. That's why they don't run in there.
The interesting thing, Mark, and I think this has something overall arching effect on society, and that is if you're a progressive, the first thing you want to do is talk about lifting up the middle class while destroying it. So the first thing you want to do is get rid of that middle class because it doesn't help your cause at all to have a strong middle class where people from the lower income levels can go through and rise to heights and through capitalism as they do. So progressive socialism doesn't allow that. And in order not to allow that, you got to take the center out, which is the middle class. And if you look and see what's happening in a lot of these states and a lot of these cities in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle, I mean, just name them. They're everywhere. The homeless are building up like crazy all along the streets. And I believe these cities are allowing that to discredit Trump being so successful in the economy, saying, well, look at our city. Look what's happening here. There are thousands of people. There are 50,000 homeless in Los Angeles. 50,000.
Now, did you hear Drew Pinsky talking about that?
No.
So you know who that is? Dr.
Drew Pinsky. Yeah, I know who he is.
Mm-hmm. He came, surprised me. He came out very boldly and said that this homeless issue in California is a health crisis because these people are spreading disease through the entire population.
Well, there's no question about it. Rats are everywhere. I mean, this is going to be like the Middle Ages if they keep this up.
So, I mean, Chuck, let me ask a question. They want all these homeless people to come into California, right?
I don't know. Do they?
Well, they accommodate them. They make it easy for homeless people to live there.
Right.
Who is advantaged by this?
I have no idea.
Is it we want to destroy, civil rights? We want to just make the country ungovernable by this? Because somebody has something to gain by this. Who and what are they gaining?
If you remember and keep this in mind, Democrats operate in chaos for the sake of chaos. It's just how they do things. If they can make it chaotic, they will make it chaotic any way they possibly can, and they thrive in chaos. So this is just part of the chaos. Well, I don't.
No. You remember the group Chaos? They were the Russian KGB in the TV series Get Smart.
No, please. Yeah.
I asked you not to tell me that.
Not to tell me that.
Would you believe? I love that show.
I know. Let's get to our
Chaos
guest.
was always the bad guys.
We need to take a little capitalist commercial right now and talk about this episode of Blunt Force Truth, by the way, is brought to you by Blue Emu Pain Relief Products. Now, I've been in show business for many years, over 50, and I'm not slowing down, but I can use a little help every now and then.
We did
Blue
say you're
Emu's-
going to go for 20 more years. So
Well, that's right. And
You are
Blue
not
Emu's
slowing
family
down.
of products are made in America and have become a staple in my life. The deep penetrating formula of Blue Emu Original is best for supporting my muscles and joints, and I'm sure you've seen it. It's on the shelf in a blue and white jar. And by the way, I use Maximum Arthritis for any arthritic pain, and the lidocaine cream for numbing pain relief. So not only do these Blue Emu formulas work great, there's no chill, no burn, no odor. Blue Emu works fast, and you won't stink. And it's available at Walmart, Walgreens, CVS, Amazon, and other fine retailers. So support the program, support Blue Emu, and help your muscles and your aches and pains. We got a great guest today. Let's get to our guest before
And we
move
do.
on.
Speaking of chaos, a guy who has spent a lot of time with the Russians, not colluding with the Russians. But we're gonna talk with Michael Caputo. Now, Michael is the managing director of Zeppelin Communications. So I don't know whether that's because he likes exploding hydrogen or he loves rock and roll. But at any rate, he provides strategy to corporations, political clients, and he's on TV. He's on CNN, Fox News. He's a former U.S. Army infantryman. But the big deal is he has worked for President Reagan. He has worked for Jack Kemp. He has worked for George Bush. He was involved with President Trump in his election. And Michael worked for Boris Yeltsin. So this is a guy who's got a really good handle on both sides. So, Michael, welcome to Blunt Force Truth.
Welcome, Michael.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Good, thank you. Now everybody knows you. Now that they can see your face, everybody goes, "Oh, that Michael
That
Caputo,
guy."
right? Not Neil Caputo. It was Michael Caputo."
Yeah. My 15 minutes were almost up, guys.
Okay.
Well, don't worry. We're going to give you 45. We're going to extend it. So, Michael, let me start with what was your involvement with the Trump campaign? Let's set the table for
Sure.
people with where you were at.
Sure. I met President Donald Trump in 1988 at the Republican convention in New Orleans, where my old friend, who I knew very well even back then, Roger Stone, asked me to help set up a room for a businessman who was going to give a speech at the convention at a hotel. So I showed up and helped set up the room, and I was in my 20s, and lo and behold, it was Donald Trump. And I intersected with him here and there, mostly socially, over the next many years. But I started working with him in 2013 when he was looking at the New York State governorship. I live in New York as well, and I do a lot of statewide race. I have done statewide races in New York. So it was natural for me to help him out doing that. When he decided not to run for governor, he decided he might buy the Buffalo Bills. And since I live in Buffalo, I stepped in and tried to help him get the Buffalo Bills. He was outbid there, thankfully, for the rest of the nation, because he soon decided to run for president. I became the director of New York State for the Republican primary in November of 2015. And after we won, we ended up, that's where we put Ted Cruz out of the race in New York. I joined the national campaign as a senior advisor in late April 2016.
Now let me ask something here, Chuck, really quick. You said you met him at the RNC in when?
In 1988. I remember Roger Stone after the event. The president came up. Mr. Trump then came up and he said to Roger, because I was standing with Roger, he came up. He said, "Well, how'd that go? How'd I do?" And he was very well received by this Republican audience, most of them delegates from all around the country. And Roger said, "You did really well. How'd you like it?" He said, "I enjoyed it." And Roger said, "You ought to think about running for president." And the president looked at Roger and was quiet and just kind of looked at him and said, "Interesting."
Well, here's where I'm going with this, Chuck. The Democrats have said that Donald Trump was a lifelong Democrat until the moment he decided to run for president.
So that's fake news.
But you're telling me he was speaking at the RNC in 1988.
Sure. And, the thing with Donald Trump, we know him here in New York as a developer, as a successful businessman, and he was engaged in politics wherever his business was touching the ground, whether it was New Jersey and Atlantic City or New York City across Manhattan, so we know him as a businessman. And from my perspective, he was kind of agnostic with his donations. He donated a lot to Chuck Schumer, had a lot of influence. Chuck Schumer had a lot of influence on how New York State went. So when the Democrats tried to claim him and say he was one of them for a time, he was playing both sides, of the fence there, and he admitted it so much, so often in his campaign. He played politics from the other side, from the donor side, but he was always, I think, a Republican to his core.
So that makes more sense, doesn't it, Chuck?
Yes, it absolutely does. And I must say that I was one of those deceived by the mainstream media's fake news. And I was afraid of Donald Trump because I thought he was probably a New York Democrat liberal, and I had no idea how that would go. It just didn't seem to play right. So I held off for a long. I was one of those holdouts. Now I'm like all in. I've got, no life preserver, just a snorkel and fins, and I'm all in.
Come on in. The water's fine, man. It really is.
Yeah, I know.
So, Michael, you did some work for the president. How did you get swept up in the in the Russian collusion thing? Because you worked for Boris Yeltsin at one point. So did they look at you saying, this, here's our contact to Russia, or what?
Well, I mean, in the final analysis, it appears that they looked at everyone who ever had Russian dressing on their salad. And for some people who didn't use Russian dressing on their salad, they poured it liberally on their salad for them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we all know now that guys like George Papadopoulos has actually never spoken to a Russian,
right?
Never had a meeting with a Russian.
Well, unless he was an FBI agent.
Right, exactly.
It could have been a fake Russian.
Right. So, I think I got caught up in this because of the fact that in 1994, I worked on George H.W. Bush's re-election, and when we were defeated by the Clintons, the Clinton administration picked me up and sent me to Moscow to meddle in their elections. I actually ran re-election campaigns and election campaigns in Russia for 7 years during the Yeltsin administration. If you remember, we were very much engaged with Yeltsin.
Yes.
We were trying to convert the Russians from enemies to friends during the time when I was there.
Now, wait a minute. Are you saying that the United States was meddling in Russia's elections?
I know, shocker, especially the orders of Bill and Hillary Clinton.
It is hysterical how everybody has gone completely crazy about how the Russians are trying to meddle in our elections. When, Obama was over in Israel trying to meddle in their election. Everybody's meddling in everybody's elections. It's not that far out of the scope of understanding and reason, and yet it seems to be blown up into this giant. The Russians didn't do anything. They didn't accomplish anything except they did through the Democrat Party, as far as I'm concerned. I think Putin got far more for his money than he ever expected, and is sitting back and watching this game saying, holy cow, I was dealt 4 aces and I had no idea.
Yeah, all for $180,000.
Thank you, Democrats.
I got to tell you, this week I'll conclude an agreement to write a book, which I'll be announcing. I'll just say that here.
Okay.
But in my view, Putin won.
Oh, absolutely.
He won by turning America against itself.
And he's still winning today.
Absolutely. And he's and I think, I spent a lot of time in Russia. I have a lot of Russian friends. Let me tell you something. I had more contact with Russians than everybody in Trump Tower combined. All of them. I lived there 7 years.
Yeah,
I was sent there by Bill Clinton. Our country is engaged with Russia for a couple of decades in attempts to try to be friendly after the fall of the wall. But never you mind the fact that Democrats and Republicans alike were registered on behalf of Russian organizations trying to help them become a part of the family of man. Forget about all of that. I think I first knew something was wrong in mid-July of 2016. By that time, I had already left the Trump campaign. And a press release came out soon after I left the campaign that said that I was one of 4 people. A Clinton press release came out. I was one of 4 people who were coordinating the president's contact and conspiracy with the Kremlin. That came out, I think, July 20th or something like that.
Or go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And then a steady drumbeat started, and I realized right then that something was up, because Russia up until then hadn't even been a topic. If you remember, in the previous presidential election, they tried to mock Mitt Romney for saying that Russia was important.
They did mock it.
Yeah, absolutely. And from my perspective, that really, my ears really perked up when I saw that press release. Not only was it out of the blue about Russian collusion for the first moment, the first time we ever heard the message, it was also involved me as someone who had already left the campaign. So I knew there was a strategy afoot, that they had kicked it off, and I had just left the campaign, but they decided to run forward with it anyway.
Now, you stood up to Mueller, didn't you?
I did.
I mean, I'd seen you on Tucker. I'd seen you on a couple of shows on Fox, and I was listening very carefully to you, and they were really trying to shake you down.
Well, you know, I learned so much during this whole thing, and I don't want to sound like I'm complaining. I think I have a story to tell. I want to write it down. I want to talk about it with you guys. I learned so much in this whole thing. The broadest thing I learned is that for all of us being so concerned about what Russia is doing and how Russia is unfairly influencing elections and invading Ukraine and etc., you know, all things that are arguably true, right?
Right.
We are living in Russia. If the Department of Justice can do what they've done to Roger Stone, to George Papadopoulos, to Carter Page, even Paul Manafort, and the rest of the folks, if they can spy upon the Republican candidate for president of the United States, if they can do that, we already live in Russia. I mean,
look what's going on with Cheryl Atkinson, what they're doing there, what they did with her.
No question. And
she wasn't running for office.
She wasn't. And the Obama administration did it to AP, did it to James Rosen.
Right.
And over again. Our nation, we also know from great reporting and from that the NSA caught people, querying the NSA database. Thank God for Admiral Rogers, who cut him off in mid-campaign in 2016. This whole thing now comes together as something, I believe. I mean, first of all, Roger Stone used to always tell me about the deep state, and I always kind of shrugged it off. I kind of thought, yeah, I did. Not anymore.
No.
You thought he was just being a little tinfoil hattish back then?
Right. But after 2 years of this investigation, I have an associate's degree from Deep State University.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do.
I can believe that, because, I mean, the thing that people don't understand, bureaucrats last forever. Politicians last for whatever they get reelected for, whatever. But that bureaucratic state stays in place, feeds on itself, and they could care less about who's president, who's vice president, it's just they care about themselves and how they can propel themselves, keep their jobs, do what they want to do without any accountability, because they have no accountability, as a politician has at least some accountability. The bureaucratic state has no accountability. And so if you pepper it full of lefties, which it is absolutely full of the left right now, and you can see it in the EPA, you can see it in all these bureaucratic organization or parts of the government, it's like you don't have a chance against that. It's a very tough nut to crack.
I spent a lot of time in Buffalo. I'm sorry, a lot of time in Washington, which is why I'm now in Buffalo. I can't stand the place, right. And I got to tell you, I watched as Republicans and Democrats alike, when they took charge of the presidential administration, would burrow their ideologues into the bureaucracy. So there are far more Democrats than Republicans.
Oh, far more.
But they're burrowed in, and they do it individually. It's Department of Transportation, but unfortunately at the State Department and the Pentagon as well. But
the State Department. Let me ask you a question. Let me interrupt you just a second and ask you this, because I have said this is true for a long, long time, and I need some backup. And you're smart enough to do it. You've been there, done that. I have always said that the most communist part of our government in history has always been the State Department. It is the most Marxist part of our government that no one knows about. Am I correct in saying that?
You are. I mean, you just have to look at Alger Hiss, read Witness by Whittaker Chambers, a book I'm reading again right now, by the way, because I think it's a terrific parallel to what we're going through. Whittaker Chambers wrote about Alger Hiss and himself and others in the Communist Party USA who had burrowed into the United States government. And in fact, was true in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. They were in there completely burrowed in, and there were those, he said in his book throughout, that the State Department was the rat's nest. And they did that on purpose because the State Department had so many fingers and hands on the levers that affected the Soviet Union. Right. So it really started there, but it's everywhere. But let's step away from the Russophobia idea that they do mess with our elections and they do burrow in, but let's just step away from Russia for a minute. Just look at the Obama White House. He came into the White House and there's something like just over 100 people in the National Security Council. He tripled it. And the average age after they went through their hiring binge was 27 years old.
And you know, I'll tell you another interesting, just to bolster your point, something else that they did, it's very clever. They put a lot of news people into these positions. They came from CNN, they came from the New York Times, they came from the Washington Post, and they just kind of interacted with each other. It's just amazing how they were able to set up that complex web of media and government.
Well, it's also, Washington is an incestuous town, right? I think more Democrats, more media are Democrats. Of course, we've seen scientific research by like Rothman and Lichter that shows that over 80% of media are Democrats. But at the same time, they marry Democrats, they marry Republicans. And also, it's really funny to watch as they moved for the first time in the history of the United States, the Obama administration moved the heads of their entire national security apparatus into commentary positions on television news, right. CNN, MSNBC, Clapper, and Brennan.
I mean, who's ever done this before? Who in the CIA and with the NSA and whoever you name the alphabet soup, whoever did that? No one. This is brand new. And
we wonder why the media bit so hard and it reacted so enthusiastically to the Russia hoax.
Well, they thought they were at the tongue of the beast.
I believe that they went in there and they planted the seeds and got the echo chamber going by moving their leading lights of the Obama national security apparatus into the media. It's really quite clever when you think about it.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's not as vast as you might think either. Mm-hmm. A few key players pulled this off, and then they went over the fence into the media. Didn't take much, did it?
No. And on top of that, there's no apology for it once it's busted. Even I believe that if the DOJ and Barr comes out with what's the fellow's name?
Durham.
Durham, they do their job and they expose all of this. I don't think the media will even live up to it then. They won't. They won't even recognize that they were part of this.
I'll give you a great example. My own example. I believe I was approached at least twice and probably 3 times by FBI informants during the summer of 2016. I believe that. I've been talking about it openly about 2 of them. The third one, it may be true, but I tried to give the Inspector General Horowitz at the DOJ that information when we figured out, my lawyer and I, in July of 2017, that of 2018, that I had been approached twice. Mm-hmm. Horowitz, we never heard back. So we wrote again in January of this year and gave him the same evidence that a Russian criminal that had worked for the FBI for 17 years as an informant had called me and offered me dirt on Hillary Clinton. That's just one example. And we sent that to both Horowitz and the gentleman out in the U.S. attorney out in Salt Lake, Huber, who was supposedly working on similar investigation. We never heard another thing back.
Yeah. So, well, they lost a lot of information too from the FBI, apparently. I
can't believe that when we brought in Attorney General Barr, that he inherited much of an investigation because they didn't talk to me.
I agree with you.
I had chapter and verse proof that this guy, Henry Greenberg, who called me in Florida, was an FBI informant. He set up a meeting. Chapter and verse, beyond a shadow of a doubt. He worked for the FBI for 17 years as an informant and was in country on an FBI informant visa when he came in front of me. I took that to the media too, and the media wasn't interested. The two different people that I discussed in the media, CNN and elsewise, because I go over into enemy lines to talk about this. I love doing Fox, but I think every network needs to hear this message. I try to, and they just called me a deep state, crackpot, Right. Mm-hmm. And now that we're finding out that, for example, that there's got to be more than one informant, people are looking at this Henry Greenberg guy, and they're still not taking it seriously. So for my mind, here's what I think. Number one, I don't think that Attorney General Barr inherited much when it came to the IG and to Huber. I don't think he inherited much. I don't think there was a lot going on. I think the IG was probably doing a typical IG investigation, which anyone who ever worked at the Department of Justice will tell you is never going to indict the agency. It'll go after a few bad apples. And I'm quite certain that's not what Attorney General Barr wanted. I think he wants a deeper dive. He's been saying that to us all along. You don't have to do anything more than just listen to the Attorney General to understand exactly what's going on. He's been completely clear on what's happening. So from my understanding, we now have the Inspector General report was supposed to be out in the first week of June. Where is it?
Yeah, it's going to be out the second week of July, maybe.
You know why? Because Barr came in, he found, and this is my guess, all right?
Well, they say they have new information coming in all the time.
Well, it's not just that. Barr came in, and I think he looked at what the Inspector General was doing. He says, we're not going to do it this way this time. We need to take a look at this, and this, and send him back to the well. That's what's going on here. And
does Barr have authority over him?
Yes, he does. I mean,
okay.
the Inspector Generals operate in with a certain degree of independence, a vast degree of independence. But and he could come out with his own report without Barr having anything to do with it. But I think that Barr and he have spoken, and instead, Barr is not saying do less. He's saying do more. I think that's a big difference when you're trying to when you're talking about influencing an Inspector General.
Now, Barr doesn't seem to be afraid of the Democrats, does he?
No, it's funny. I love this. I just watch every word he says. I look at every syllable. I look at his face to see every shred of information I can get from every message he sends, because my family has lived in hell for over 2 years now because of this. We've lost everything because of this. Everything.
I'm so sorry.
So
tell us about that, Michael. What happened?
Well, I mean, there are 40 families like mine, 40 or 50, original Trumpers who weren't subjects or target of the investigation, just witnesses. And I think in that regard, like Carter Page, never been charged with anything. They looked at him. They went through 40, 50 hours of discussions. Look at J.D. Gordon, Navy commander, served honorably, retired. They shook his family all the way to their foundations, trying to prove that he was taking orders from the Kremlin. This went through, Waleed Ferris unfairly treated. I know one family whose both husband and wife, mom and dad, lost their jobs because they were witnesses in this investigation. There are dozens of us. And it's like right now, with the report come in and it's been filed and now it's been out redacted, it's being discussed. All of us are coming out like Japanese soldiers at the end of the war, coming out of the jungle with long beards and bedraggled uniforms. We haven't talked to each other because our lawyers won't let us.
Right.
We haven't even understood what really happened to each one of us. And now we're talking, and we're finding out that everybody lost houses, jobs, children lost their ability to go to college, the college of their choice. I mean, it just shook families all the way to the foundation. We were particularly targeted for harassment and death threats because I was out in the media so much. Most of the folks who were in this jackpot did the smart thing.
My hat's off to you. You really took a chance and went out there and talked, and nobody else would. And, congratulations for your courage.
So what's going on with you now? I mean, how are you getting your life put back together now, or is this still ruining everything?
It takes a while. I was, I had the biggest mouth and set myself up for all the death threats and everything. And the upside of that, you never think there'd be an upside, is I got a call from the president right after the report was filed. And he invited myself and my wife and my children and my mother-in-law into the White House. And we sat and had a little, 35-minute meeting with him. And later Melania came in. And I've known them for a long time. And I got a feeling that day, and my wife, who suffered so much, she's got a feeling that day that it's over now and that we can move forward. But, at this point, every step is a meditation. Because we've lost everything. We've got a lot of support out there. The president himself is giving us a thumbs up. But, you make a wrong move and they're going to take you out. You make a wrong step and the media who's tried to hate you so much and the people who wanted to see you go to jail and are being disappointed, they're going to take you out. So from my perspective, right now I'm signing a contract to write a book. I'm taking my family somewhere to disappear for a little while, to just relax. We're exhausted, and I've been carrying, everywhere I go, I carry a pistol. It's like we have a shotgun station by our front door and by our back door with biometric locks, and we've had people come to our house. This is a really bad thing, and Roger Stone's going through all of this right now. What we've gone through, and I think we're coming out of. Roger is in the maelstrom right now, getting attacked in restaurants. It's not going away.
Yeah, we had Jerry Corsi on the show recently too, and he certainly has stood up to him, but took a beating too. Where was your biggest loss, Michael, other than emotionally? Did you have to spend a lot of money in legal fees on this thing, or what?
I spent, I came into this thing. I did the smart thing. Everybody around me was just ruined. Like, I'm an old Manafort guy, Roger Stone guy. I've known Rick Gates for 15, 20 years. All these guys who end up getting indicted, friends of mine, and I think some of them wrongfully indicted. I don't think Roger Stone did anything wrong. Paul Manafort, he has some financial crimes that are serious, but had nothing to do with the president of the United States or the campaign. But I'm watching all those guys go through with the meat grinder that they're in has really made my family fearful, because it was very clear that they wanted us to join that special club. The special counsel did. And at the very beginning, I was advised, because my PR firm does litigation communications. We do a lot of work with law firms. And so I know a lot of lawyers, a lot of them U.S. prosecutors, former U.S. prosecutors, and they said right away, get the best lawyer available. Number one, because you're going to need it. And number two, they're all going to be gone pretty quick, so you better go. And I was very lucky. I hired the former New York State Attorney General and former U.S. Attorney for the Western District here in Buffalo. His name, Dennis Vacco, Lippis Mathis. Typically, I think he's the best lawyer of all of them. I think he's better than, I dare say, the White House team. I mean, he's the best. And people say, you're just a witness. Why would you spend so much money on hiring a pipe swinger like Dennis? Because nobody knows more about white-collar government crime than a guy who was New York State AG and U.S. Attorney, right? And I told him, as I just repeated the advice that was given me by my friends and the clients who are attorneys, you don't go in there with your brother-in-law. You don't go in there with your divorce attorney. I had an attorney offer to pay me to take the case because he wanted the exposure.
Make his bones, yeah.
Right. I went in with Dennis. He's not cheap, but he certainly did everything he could for me. On prices and stuff, but I paid it's going to be over $200,000 in legal fees.
Did you lose clients in your business too because of this?
I lost my business, basically. The only clients.
Really?
Yes. I had to close offices, lay off more than half my staff. And ironically, the only clients that stayed with me were the Democrats. I don't understand that.
Wow.
Well, I understand that. That makes perfect sense, Chuck, because they know he didn't do anything.
Well, yeah, but all my clients, I'll tell you one, burger chain, bespoke burger chain, great operation, friends of mine, I love them dearly. As soon as it came out the left figured out that I was doing the burger chain's PR and advertising, they started boycotting them, going inside the store, screaming at the top of their lungs, Facebook, Twitter. And my friend called me up and he said, yeah, we're going to have to drop you. And I said, why? And he explained this boycott, and I said, you understand none of those people eat meat, right? But I did a national touring ballet that I helped put together that was doing a national tour in the United States, starring Russia's #1 ballerina, who I know. And I lost that client. How ironic is that? I was so hot that not even a Russian ballerina could. It just went bam right into the wall. And we're still hanging on. I'd like to rebuild it, but right now my wife and I, I'm kind of, remember that show Kung Fu?
Oh yes.
I want to be Chiang Kai-shek, Tsing Wai Chang or whatever his name was. I want to walk the earth like Kane in Kung Fu. That's what I want to do. I just want to roll up a bedroll, have my kids come with me, and people just don't mess with me anymore. Because
having people snatch the pebbles from your hand.
Exactly. Because if you do, I'm going to kick you.
Kwang Cho Chain, I believe.
Is that whatever? Kwang Chai Kane or whatever.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Who was neither a martial arts expert or an Asian, but
or much of an actor, but yeah.
But hey, it worked. Now he'd be misappropriating a race now if he was doing that show today.
So let me ask you something. What do you see in the future now that the dust has kind of settled on our side of the, except for the media, but it's the Mueller report's finished, whether they accept it or not. It is what it is. You can talk to people now who have been abused by the system. Let's just say for all practical purposes, it's over, even though the media won't let it go.
Yeah, it's not over in Congress.
Well, it's never over there. So what happens now? Did that rock that you was it thrown into the lake and sunk, or is it just skipping across the top and gaining momentum? Are people going to be able to skip and recover? Is there any way to recover? Have they been just decimated? Is there any recompense, anything coming back for government, any recognition that you were taken advantage of? Because you were. And so are the others. There's no question about it. You were abused, just like I think Donald Trump is abused every day by the media. You guys were abused by your government. And
I look more at Carter Page and J.D. Gordon.
They were absolutely abused.
George Papadopoulos, these guys that actually, I think I'm compared to those guys kind of marginal in the level of harassment I took.
Well, is there any recourse for any of you?
Yeah, can you sue them?
Our attorneys are talking. I'd like to see some kind of recourse. And I was, most of my friends who were involved in this or were coming out of the jungle, squinting at the sun. They have a different kind of perspective of this because they weren't able to raise the money for their legal fees because they kept quiet. And I went out and I screamed at the top of my lungs and I raised every cent that I spent. And I also gave an additional, 6 figures to others who were caught up in this as witnesses. We had a house painter that just testified last week, J.D. Gordon. Yeah, a house painter who is connected to Roger Stone. He used to be his driver before the election. So
they're trying to indict Roger Stone's house painter?
Last week he testified, right? It's supposed to be all over. He testified last week. So it ain't over yet. But
why is this still going?
Because I think they're dotting I's and crossing T's. I think this group, they're crossing I's and dotting T's. That report was just shot through with omissions and innuendo. What's next, you ask me? What's next? I can tell you what I think is next. I think I probably understand more about this than most people do because not only was I caught up in the middle of it, and not only were my dearest friends, victimized and prosecuted and thrown in jail. One of my dearest, oldest friends, Paul Manafort, is going to Rikers into the hole for some ungodly reason.
Right. Let me ask you about Paul Manafort. Now, I don't know much about him. I don't know his history. I understood it was a little bit shady in some things that he'd done, but I understand that his past, these things that they are now talking about or convicted him for through Mueller, all of those things had been brought before the DOJ, to my understanding, and you would know the answer to this, and they were dismissed by the DOJ prior to this whole Mueller thing blowing up. Is that correct or not?
It's largely correct. The DOJ or the FBI don't give you a clearance letter if they decide not to prosecute you, but they investigated Paul and Rick and his whole operation in Ukraine prior to the 2016 election even really kicking off. And they had been on him for several months. We found out later, of course, and then decided not to prosecute. And then went to the Trump campaign and they reopened the case. Mm-hmm. However, Manafort is an old school guy. I remember when I was a driver for Roger and Paul's lobbying firm, a driver. So I know them for a long time. I was very young at the time. They were masters of the universe, you might say, in Washington. There were Republicans like Paul Manafort and Democrats like Vic Camber who would lobby on behalf of foreign nations. And, some of their clients weren't, so tasteful or whatever. Others were. But both of them, like Vic Camber and Paul Manafort, always worked for nations that were our allies. For example, in the Reagan era, the Philippines president was our ally, wasn't a great guy, but Paul Manafort was his consultant. Jonas Savimbi, a revolutionary. In Africa, there were arguments that he was a brutal dictator in waiting as a revolutionary leader, and Paul Manafort represented him, but that's because the Reagan administration has supported Savimbi. Vic Camber did the same thing during the Carter and other Democrat administrations. It's a long-standing tradition, and they've all forever avoided registering if they could under this FARA Act, Foreign Agents Registration.
Right.
For years.
I call it the Podesta Act now.
Right. It's never been prosecuted. Never. And that's certainly not on Podesta. And now suddenly it's become fashionable and even accepted by the defense community, for example, which usually fights back like the ACLU and says, why, this is unfair, this law's never been used, etc. This law's never been used. Now, Paul Manafort's, one of his longest sentences is a FARA violation. Meanwhile, Podesta's brother Tony's not going to jail for a FARA violation.
Well, I know it's so unfair and unjust, but here they stick Manafort. I feel for the guy, because it's the Southern District that stuck him in Rikers Island and literally put him in what do you call it?
Solitary confinement.
That's
cruel and unusual.
I mean, the guy's.
What's even worse? It's awful. I hate to tell you this because I sit in New York State right now, and I'm sorry to say this, but it's not even the Southern District of New York that wants him at Rikers. It's not. The Southern District would be perfectly happy keeping him in prison where he is in federal custody. This is the city of New York's state attorney, the local district attorney in New York City, who is calling upon Paul Manafort to be brought and put into the hole at Rikers, to wait trial on the same charges that Paul Manafort has faced on a federal level.
Don't they have to present a judge with a reason to do that? 3
weeks ago, check this out. This is where I live. 3 weeks ago, the Assembly and the Senate of New York State, both controlled by Democrats, and the governor of New York State, Democrat Andrew Cuomo, rewrote the law so that double jeopardy was legal in New York State.
Right.
We call it the Manafort law. They passed that law, and then they said, let's put him in the hole. They raised their hand to put him in the hole, and if the feds give him up with no date even in sight, he might not get a trial date for 9 or 10 months, maybe more.
Which violates his rights to speedy trial.
He has no rights. He's the wrong political party.
Well, let me point something out to you, Chuck. It makes sense when I say this. Joe Biden, years ago, in an interview when he was a young senator, literally said in an interview, those of us in the power and government have the right to take your constitutional rights away from you anytime we want.
Well, I can tell you they've done it to me. They unmasked me. I'm quite certain that they got into all my electronics, all my messaging and voice, everything. It's just, that's the way it is. And like I said, in Russia, they have a group of people we talk about. I'm a Russia, expert or whatever. And they're called the Siloviki. Siloviki. It's basically a Russian word that means loosely the national security deep state, right? And the Slovaki have always run Russia, even when it was the USSR. They've always run that nation, even when it was the Tsars. The national
They're running here too.
They're running it here too. We have our own Slovaki in the United States. Now, granted, we flushed Peter Strzok. We flushed, a variety. Maybe we flushed a variety of others. But Comey's gone. All the rest of them walked out when the regime changed. We still have people in place right now that will do the same thing tomorrow. And by the way, just as an aside, for everyone to think about, in the 1970s, we had a New York Times report come out that exposed that the CIA was killing foreign leaders abroad extrajudiciously, just assassinating illegally foreign leaders, right? And then we found out that the FBI was not just photocopying the outside of our mail like they were allowed to do, opening it with a steamer and reading it and copying it and seaming it shut. This and a variety of other things, spying on Americans, killing foreign leaders, caused an upheaval in Washington from which we got what we called the Church Committee and the Select Committee in the Senate, the Pike Committee, a committee in the House, and the Eisenhower Commission that the administration put together to investigate the CIA, the NSA, which we really didn't even know existed at the time, the FBI, and the IRS, those four agencies. And we got fundamental reform out of that era. In 15 months, from when the Church Committee was founded to when it was over with their recommendations, it was like 15 months.
What are the years? What are the years?
That was 74 to 76. And what I'm saying here is we need the same level of fundamental reform. Back then, I have friends of mine that got in the CIA in the early 80s, just after the Church Committee's bite came out. Like hundreds of agents were rifted. And my friend brought up in the lunchroom something about he saw on TV that day. It was political. And an old hand in the lunchroom said, "Son, if you want a career at this agency, you will never speak of politics again. Let me tell you about something called the Church Committee." And he gave him the warning whisper that went through the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, and the IRS for an entire generation. But those men and women are gone.
We're always a generation away, aren't we?
We need another Church Pike Eisenhower examination of our national security.
How do we get it? How do we get that?
Well, we had it going. I mean, listen, I would say compare what Barr is doing to the Eisenhower Committee, the administration side of that three-pronged fork, right? I thought that we were going to see something out of Lindsey Graham. I'm disappointed in him. I don't know why he decided to back off and give everything to the Barr team, right? I understand, on the surface why he's doing that. But that is the Church Committee side of the three-pronged fork. And of course, the House was the Pike Committee, and we're not going to get anything substantive out of a Democratic House. So I think all we have hopes for is a Senate and an administration push. We're halfway in that direction. If we had more action out of the Senate, I'd be better off, I think.
I want people to understand something here, Chuck, just for a second, and that is, if you listening to this show think that, well, this happens to Michael Caputo, this happens to, Papadopoulos, this can't happen to me.
Oh.
This can happen to you.
Let me tell you something. I live in a hallmark town called East Aurora, New York, right? We have brick streets. We have a five and dime. We don't even have a Walmart. My office until recently was above the cobbler. I lived in, even though I went to Russia, I worked in Washington, I decided, like I said, I wanted to walk the earth like Caine in Kung Fu. I came to where I was brought up to bring up my kids. I was out here just living life like everybody else. And they came in and snatched me.
Yeah, if they can go after Roger Stone's house painter, then they can go after you.
Everyone
needs to understand we're living in a police state and we're all at risk. It's not just people on the news.
That's right. I'm telling you, I saw MC trucks. You know what those are? The trucks that have the gizmo on the front that can locate your cell phone. We had MC trucks following people around that were witnesses in this investigation. FBI deployed MC trucks out in front of their houses, and it was just the spookiest thing you ever saw.
Well, Chuck,
here we are.
Yeah.
Chuck, you said something to me a long time ago because you've lived under a microscope because of being in Hollywood. And something you said to me a long time ago was every time you leave your house, just imagine that somebody's holding a camera at you. Yeah. But now we're even beyond that because now we're not even safe in the house.
We're not.
I mean, in my business, I had publicists for Warner Brothers and people like that, telepictures who wanted me to do all these. I wouldn't do anything. I wouldn't talk to the press even then. And I was just a game show host because I knew that everything I said, they would take and twist and turn, which they always did to make it more salacious, more whatever newsworthy in their point of view. I frustrated every PR person that ever worked for me because I just wouldn't pay any. I paid no attention to reviews. I could care less. I just went and did my job. Leave me alone.
He continues to frustrate everybody too. Michael, I have a question for you too.
We go one more thing.
Sure.
Yes, and I want to ask you a question too.
Sure.
So go ahead.
You look at Comey, Clapper, et cetera, all these people struck. They did this. It was a perverse sense, as A.G. Barr says, a Praetorian Guard.
Right.
Who thought their ideas were the right ideas and you all just have to follow. That their perverse sense of right and wrong was what should drive this nation. So they bent and broke laws to do what they did. They did this in many ways with great faith. It was hubris. It was perverse. But it was a great faith that they in themselves above our country. And I think everybody needs to understand that in order to overcome this, right now, we're nowhere near overcoming it. We're flirting with it. But to overcome this, we're going to have to have equal or greater faith. And I mean that in every sense of the word faith. We're going to need it. And we're going to need great men, great women, great Americans. We're going to need heroes to get through this. Heroes. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, are we up for it? And
Michael, I think you are one of those heroes.
No, I'm not.
I have a question for you.
Well, if you don't think you are, become one.
So
while you're dragging your stick with a bag on the back of it across the country.
Well, no, he's going to be Kane, not a hobo.
Oh, well.
Kane had a bedroll. He didn't carry a stick with a bag. Come on, Chuck.
Sorry about that.
So, Michael, how much threat are the Russians to the United States in reality?
That's a great question because I lived there. I lived in the shadow of what we used to call the KGB, the FSB there. I spent time. I know a lot of Russians here. We have a lot of Russian emigres in the United States now. Millions, I think 1 million of them probably. In southern Florida, for example, there are something like 300,000 new Russian emigres living just between, Palm Beach and Miami. The Russians, as we call them, are an integral part of the world society now, and they never were before, but they are now. And I would say to every man and every woman that I've met in southern Florida of Russian origin, the vast majority of them are there because they don't want to be around Vladimir Putin. For whatever reason, they have. A lot of them are artists and rock and rollers and people of creative expression. They don't want to be there. They've emigrated. They had the power to do so. There's a whole nation of people that don't have the power to leave. And many of them don't want to because Vladimir Putin has put together an authoritarian rule that satisfies a deep-seated, I believe, Russian need that I discovered living there 7 years for a strong leader. It's in their soul. They want one. It comes from Tsarist times, even pre-Tsarist times. And they look at themselves as a nation that should be ruled differently than the United States. I believe that Putin is doing things like trying to impact elections, probably doing them in ways that we would never do by stealing or whatever emails. Maybe we wouldn't do that. We certainly aren't doing it. Maybe we should start. But Russia is always going to, as Putin's in charge, always going to be positioned adversarially. And we should be working with them like Ronald Reagan said. Trust them, but verify.
So who's the biggest risk to America if my choices were Russia, China, or our own bureaucratic government? What's the biggest risk to Americans' freedom right now?
It's funny you asked that. I'm always reading, and I read a lot of Russian dystopian novels that are translated into English. And Russians, like futuristic kind of Isaac Asimov types, They never write about America. They write about China as their rival. When they write about America, they write about America as something that once was important and is no longer important. And I haven't found one futuristic Russian novelist who believes otherwise, and I think that's an amazing thing to think about. From my perspective, from our problem as Americans, is that our biggest problem is not China nor Russia. It's China or Russia who learned to manipulate the people of the United States to turn against each other. That's our biggest enemy, the one who masters that ability. I don't think Putin's mastered it. I think he showed that it can be done. I think
the media and the Democrats have mastered it. Honest to God, I really do.
Oh, I mean,
and then they blame Trump, which is very interesting. They project it onto him.
Every single bit of information that Hillary's dossier pulled in from the Russian intelligence services was planted there by the Russian intelligence services. We're going to find all of this out. It's impossible that Steele was contacting Russian intelligence operatives and asking them for information on Donald Trump, where they didn't take that directly to the head of the FSB and say, we need to, and they went out and it's all planned.
I hope the American people understand why the FBI, the CIA, the NSA went through Australia, Britain, and Italy in order to accomplish all these things. I think they may have a little hard time getting their head wrapped around, because these agencies couldn't do this in the United States. They had to go out of country and do a workaround.
To allies.
And I'll tell you.
To our allies, right.
One of the reasons why I think that they didn't envelop me with the informants they sent to me, like they enveloped Papadopoulos and Carter Page, is that I wasn't in a position they could lure me offshore. I think that they use these foreign partners in the intelligence services very skillfully with a certain degree of plausible deniability. But I don't think they're going to be able to deny that of William Barr. I think they're going to fail in their effort. I think they designed something that completely failed them, this coup. And the problem, like you said, we're going to have is convincing the media that it's important enough to report on, just because it the problem being that it violates their ideology.
The only time the media will report on this is when it is so overwhelmingly truthful to everyone out there that they have to get on board. They will come, not reluctantly. You'll have to put a rope around their neck and drag them to the park. And then
they'll claim they were always there.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Michael, we would love to have you back and follow this as this is going. Now, you have a podcast out.
Yes, I do. I wax on these crazy theories of mine learned in the alembic of the Russian investigation at stillstandingpodcast.com. Stillstandingpodcast.com. Right. I started that up recently because every time I answer the phone, somebody's like, "How are you, man? Are you okay?" And my answer is always, "Well, I'm still standing."
So you people listen to podcasts. Are you on iTunes, Stitcher?
All of them. All the above. From a featured podcast on news.com. I'm proud to be on every single platform for your listening pleasure.
We're so glad to have you, because you have insight to things that other people don't, and you explain them very well. You've been a great guest, and we really appreciate you taking your time to come on and share it with our audience.
Thank you very much.
And folks, if you go to the show notes at bluntforcetruth.com, look for the episode with Michael Caputo. There'll be a link to all of the websites for him. There'll be a link to his podcast. I encourage you to go listen to it. I am going to start. I admit I have not been listening to your podcast. I listened to it last night, and it's great. And I'm going to start becoming a listener.
Me too. Yep.
Thank you. I'm a fan of yours. I'll keep watching. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Well, that's it for our show for today. I hope you enjoyed it. And our guest. And if you want to follow up with him, you can go to our show notes and see everything that's there. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you next time on Blunt Force Truth.